All right, well, we'll get started here. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kerry Timchuk, Executive Director, and so delighted all of you can be here tonight. And if you look closely, you'll see that I'm wearing a tie. My tie has fish tacos on it. So as close as I can get to whales in Paul's honor. Was 50 years ago today, November 12th, 1970, when a young cub reporter at K2 in Portland named Paul Linnman and a young cub cameraman named Doug Brazil were given an assignment by their boss to travel to the little coastal town of Florence, Oregon, little knowing that that assignment would change their lives. And the story that they reported and filmed would be downloaded some 350 plus million times on the internet, remaining the kind of the most remarkable story of their career some 50 years later. And we're honored to have with us tonight Paul Linnman. Wave to the crowd, Paul. And of course, Doug Brazil. Welcome, Doug. Here you are 50 years later. And tonight we're going to have a little conversation for a while. We're going to walk through the event, share some memories. We'll show the film. And then at the end, I said, we'll take some Q&A from the audience. There's a lot of puns coming in the audience too, in the chat room. Everyone wants to have a whale of a good time. That seems like a popular sentiment. So
people have been blubbering about it for years, Gary.
So Paul, yeah,
blubbering about it for years.
Blubbering, I get it. So Paul, let's start. Let's go back to that day, November 12th, 1970. Take us from the beginning.
Well, it actually started the day before, Kerry. Doug and I were called together by our boss, our news director, a guy named Pat Wilkins, who was a pretty well-known anchor person in Portland. And he told us that he wanted us the next day to get in an airplane, which was a shocker because Channel 2 never paid for air transportation, and go to Florence and cover the disposal of this whale. And Doug and I we'd worked on, major stories. I mean, things that we thought were very important. And we were kind of a all-star team at Channel 2 because I started as a film editor. Doug's an excellent photographer, and we could get breaking news on the air faster than anybody. I'd write, and then I'd go pull the sound bites. Doug would cut the B-roll. I'd take him the sound bites, he'd put them together, and we could get stuff on the air really, really fast. So we thought we were really flying and enjoying.
You called yourselves the Video Death Rangers, I believe.
We did call ourselves Video Death Rangers. And when Pat said, "Hey, go to Florence and this whale disposal thing," we said, "Could you send somebody else?" And he said, "They're going to use dynamite." And we said, "What time do we leave?" And so the next day we took off. We went down there, and
not only did you go down there, but the station in 1970 gave you a plane, chartered a plane. Yeah. Is that correct?
Small Cessna. Yeah. And when we got down there and let Doug pick it up, I mean, when we parked out on the South Jetty behind the dunes and stepped out of the car, which we'd borrow from the operator of the airport, the smell was enough to knock you over. And we were still quite a distance from the whale, Doug.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah, your first memories here. So.
Yeah, exactly. We walked up to the dune to get over the top and down to the beach. And the wind was blowing out of the north slightly, and the smell was just overwhelming. So we figured a way to get on the windward side of the whale to take any of the pictures. Thankfully, that's where they're planting the dynamite, and that helped. But there's pictures I think you've seen in the video of one kid going around. He's got a little hat on and holding his nose just to indicate just how bad it was. There's nobody near the whale except those people that absolutely had to be.
Now, you two were also, this is 1970, the equipment was much more cumbersome than it is today. And you were both carrying a lot of equipment?
Heavy wooden tripod, big sound camera, an Oricon 16 millimeter, Bolex silent camera 16 millimeter, and whatever you were carrying your extra stuff in, Doug. I can't remember if it was like a suitcase or what, but we had a lot of stuff.
Right. You had an amplifier, you had a battery pack if you needed it for lights. It was a lot of junk, if you will.
So, Paul, were there other crews there?
No, and I think we were talking about this earlier today. I think I know why. We were the only TV crew there. I believe there was a reporter there from the Eugene Register Guard newspaper, and there was a reporter there from the Siosla News in Florence. There was no other TV, and I honestly believe that Pat Wilkins, the news director that sent us on our way, told us that the day before he'd been given a tip by somebody in the ODOT, the Department of Transportation, that dynamite was the method going to be used to dispose of this whale. And I think that was because Pat had friends inside of ODOT that they didn't tip anybody but us. And I think that's why we alone got the story.
And that's one of the funny things about this is a lot of people think, why the heck is ODOT, the State Highway Division, assigned to a whale on a beach?
Mm-hmm. Well, the beaches in Oregon, as you well know, Carrie, are public thoroughfares. They're actually state highways. And so it fell to the State Department of Transportation to remove the whale. And I've always felt in retrospect that, these are people that are expert at this type of thing, blowing up hard rock and such for roadway construction and so forth. But with no experience whatsoever with this type of situation where you've got a big blubbery whale, the sand has got sea underneath it. The sand is soft, relatively speaking. And so I think that one of the situations they bumped into was it was new to them. How do we pack it? Where do we pack it? And how much do we use to get rid of this big thing that isn't a hillside that they had expertise in removing?
So you describe it in your book, Paul, The Exploding Whale, that it was like something out of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, seeing a dynamite, a detonator, a plunger, boxed, says TNT on it. Is that correct?
I'm not sure it said TNT on it, but there definitely was a plunger. And you remember, Doug, we actually said, hey, there's a plunger.
Yeah.
Just like we see in the Roadrunner.
Yeah, that's what we were going to base our countdown on.
So then you, Paul, you're on scene and you start doing reporting. And who do you interview?
Well, I interviewed the man in charge. His name was George Thornton, and he was a very nice man. He was a Southern District assistant engineer who had been tasked with removing the whale. And the reason for that was his bosses, it was the opening weekend of hunting season in Oregon, and his bosses had gone on hunting trips and left him holding the bag, if you will. And he's a very nice guy, very, engineer type, straightforward, talking business. And you saw the interview and the story, and he gave us answers as best he could. And in fact, rewatching the story, maybe today, the new digitized version that I haven't watched probably in a decade, I realized that the first answer to the question I asked him, he said, we're not sure how much dynamite to use. I'd completely forgotten about that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it was true.
And that there might be little pieces or maybe something larger that we might have to deal with afterwards. And by golly,
right,
what they had to deal with.
Well, this seems like a good time then to, we've taken it up, you're done the reporting, you're asking around. And so they tell you they're going to blow up the whale. And then where do you two go?
Well, we're backed up about 1,000 yards, and they tell us that there's somebody on the dune down near the whale, up toward land, that would wave a flag just before detonation. And so we're behind the camera, and I've got the silent camera up to my face, and Doug is behind the sound camera on the tripod, and we're ready, and the flag waves.
If I may, the one thing we use the silent film camera with, it's a little Bolex. You can speed up the time the film goes through the camera in order to get slow motion playback. So we wanted to get that explosion in slow motion. So Paul, thankfully, handled that camera, and we were waiting for the guy to give the signal. He gave the signal. Well, it takes about 5 seconds for all the film to go through the camera. So by the time they actually blew it up, that film, the camera was done. So we didn't get any but slow-mo.
I fired early.
Yeah, not his fault. He waited for the signal. They gave the signal, but then it was a delay before they actually plunged.
I know, and it took us a while to figure out afterwards. We're looking for that silent film so we can see what it looks like in slow motion, and we can't find anything with an image on it. And Doug finally realized, well, it ran through too fast. They hadn't blown it up yet, and you were out of film.
Yeah.
And how many people do you think were on the beach with you at this time? So
what do you think, Doug? 30?
Besides there were more ODOT people than anybody. And then there were, maybe a dozen to 30 folks at the most, but it was very unpublicized as far as I could tell. I mean, these people were just down on the beach for a relatively okay November day. And then they happened on this whale. And why they stuck around with all the stink coming out of there, I'm not really sure. But I guess they were attracted by the notion that they're going to set off this dynamite and blow the thing up.
Whales washing up on beaches in Oregon are not a rarity. And as long as they're there, people are aware of it. I mean, the word gets around and people want to see a seal or a whale or whatever it is. And we're smart enough to know not to get near something. And if it's a newborn whale that a mother has deposited on the beach for a short time, not to go near it. So we're all savvy in that regard. But people are so interested in these mammals, these large mammals that migrate past our state twice a year, that the chance to get to see one, up close is really a great opportunity. So I think word gets around, but like Doug, I was surprised that there wasn't a bigger crowd that day, and thankfully there wasn't.
How long had the whale been there before you got there?
I think 3 or 4 days is my recollection.
So go into describe the smell a little bit more for us.
Well, I really can't. I can still conjure it up. There used to be a meat rendering plant out in North Portland next to Heron Lakes Golf Course. And when that thing was up and operating and sending smoke out into the environment, it came close, but actually nowhere near the smell of that whale. And I've always said to people, there's no way I can describe it. It was horrible, but when they blew the thing open, it was twice as horrible. What do you tell people, Doug?
Well, it's much like imagining, if you will, that you have a piece of fish that you put in your refrigerator at home, and then for some reason it gets stuck at the back, and it's left there for a month or something. You pull it out, and of course immediately you begin to smell it, and you open the container, and then you're knocked on the floor. It's just that bad. It was horrible.
So Sarah, are we ready to go?
We are.
Okay.
We are. All right.
It had to be said, the Oregon State Highway Division not only had a whale of a problem on its hands, it had a stinking whale of a problem. What to do with one 45-foot, 8-ton whale dead on arrival on the beach near Florence? It had been so long since a whale had washed up in Lane County, nobody could remember how to get rid of one. In selecting its battle plan, the Highway Division decided the carcass couldn't be buried because it might soon be uncovered. It couldn't be cut up and then buried because nobody wanted to cut it up, and it couldn't be burned. So dynamite it was, some 20 cases or a half-ton of it. The hope was that the long-dead Pacific gray whale would be almost disintegrated by the blast, and that any small pieces still around after the explosion would be taken care of by seagulls and other scavengers. Indeed, the seagulls had been standing nearby all day. As everything was being made ready, we asked George Thornton, the highway engineer in charge of the project, for his final observation.
Well, I'm confident that it'll work. The only thing is we're not sure just exactly how much explosives it'll take to disintegrate this thing so the scavengers, seagulls, and crabs and whatnot can clean it up.
Is there any chance it might be more than a one-day job?
If there's any large chunks left, and we may have to do some other cleanup, possibly set another charge.
The dynamite was buried primarily on the leeward side of the big mammal, so as most of the remains would be blown toward the sea. About 75 bystanders, most of them residents who had first found the whale to be an object of curiosity before they tired of its smell, were moved back a quarter of a mile away. The sand dunes there were covered with spectators and land lubber newsmen, shortly to become land blubber newsmen, for the blast blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds. Get a while?
All right, Fred, you can take your hands out of your ears. Here comes pieces of...
Our cameras stopped rolling immediately after the blast. The humor of the entire situation suddenly gave way to a run for survival as huge chunks of whale blubber fell everywhere. Pieces of meat passed high over our heads while others were falling at our feet. The dunes were rapidly evacuated as spectators escaped both the falling debris and the overwhelming smell. A parked car over a quarter of a mile from the blast site was the target of one large chunk. The passenger compartment literally smashed. Fortunately, no human was hit as badly as the car. However, everyone on the scene was covered with small particles of dead whale. As for the success of the effort, well, the seagulls who were supposed to clean things up were nowhere in sight, either scared away by the explosion or kept away by the smell. That didn't really matter. The remaining chunks were of such a size that no respectable seagull would attempt to tackle anyway. As darkness began to set in, the highway crews were back on the beach burying the remains, including a large piece of the carcass which never left the blast site. It might be concluded that should a whale ever wash ashore in Lane County again, those in charge will not only remember what to do, they'll certainly remember what not to do.
So I need to make one correction, and I saw a screen question raising it, and that is, what kind of whale was it? I incorrectly reported it was a Pacific gray whale because that's what I was told. Later on, I was advised that it was actually a sperm whale. And years after that, I had some communication from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego indicating you're always calling that a 45-foot, 8-ton whale. If it's a 45-foot sperm whale, it weighs a lot more than 8 tons. So I apparently got that wrong too. Kerry, I'm not hearing you all of a sudden.
How about now? Good.
Yeah, yeah.
So I said the blast blasted Blubber beyond all believable bounds. That's great news writing.
Well, you know, I'm happy to say that people who watch over such things, people that are into journalism, have been kind to me in saying that the script has held up over the years. I so much wish I hadn't written that sentence, because Ryan, who I know is with us tonight, my number 3 son, often walks into the house and says, "Dad, do you realize that blast blasted Blubber beyond all believable bounds?" I want to kill him.
So tell me about, I mean, you talked about it there, but tell me about the blast and how much did Blubber almost hit you? The smell, the blood coming down, what was it? You soaked? What was it like?
Well, I'll start and let Doug finish, because you heard the sound, you heard the whale pieces of the blubber hitting the ground around us. And that's the sound that we heard. And when it takes a second for it to click in that, oh, things are landing around you. And the blubber, of course, is very, very dense. I mean, a little piece the size of the last joint in your little finger could go through you like a bullet. And I think Doug and I both had the same realization at the same moment, where we need to get out of here, and started to run. But both of us have been fortunate not to have had to serve in a war anywhere or be in combat anywhere. But I think, Doug, that might have been as close as we'll ever feel to being fired upon by something.
Yeah, and in some cases worse than bullets. Little pieces of whale. And of course, along with this, you can hear the splats. Those splats on sand have to be pretty large pieces that are coming down. There was also the big crunch we heard, which was the one that landed on the car, the Oldsmobile. Mm-hmm. But the rest of it, which didn't make a lot of noise, was the spray, which is the blood and the oil of the whale, which is raining down on us like a fall storm. And that's the stuff that carried the stink that stayed with us for, well, to this day, in my memory.
Yeah. And I looked down at my beige raincoat, and it was literally pink and sparkling. Yeah. And that's blood and whale oil and pieces of blubber that were now on us. And Doug, when we got back in that small aircraft, that little Cessna, it was unbelievable.
My friend Tom Bugus writes, when I was growing up in Hammond, the bioproducts company in Hammond used to hunt whales and render them at their plant. The smell permeated the entire town for the duration of the dismemberment, and he's never forgotten that smell. So
had to be close.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love it in your book, Paul. You wrote that, what an ignominious way to go, taken out by a flying piece of dead whale meat. So.
Well, to us, it was like a second explosion. As Doug says, we turned around and ran in the opposite direction of the whale, and we were not inside of the parking lot. We were behind some dunes, and all of a sudden, there's a second explosion, which was that piece of whale blubber, which is about the size of a small or mid-sized coffee table, flattening Walter Umenhofer's Oldsmobile. And now we realize not only are we covered with this crap, but we got to get the cameras down there and get some pictures of that. So Doug raced down with his camera and got the pictures you saw.
And Walter became somewhat of a media figure from this as well. So
yeah, and his was an interesting story. He worked for the Diamond Charcoal Briquette Company, and he was in Florence on a secret mission scouting possible new sites for another plant. And they didn't want their charcoal briquette competitors to know that they were considering that part of Oregon for a new plant. So he was on spy mission to look at this property when his car got smashed.
And as he talked about it, he said that he bought it from a dealer in Eugene that offered him a whale of a deal.
Yeah.
Was what their advertisement was. So
Yeah, and I used to think that was BS, and then I saw a sign in the car lot where he bought it. And in fact, that is very true. Whale of a deal.
So you've got this film. The incident's over. It's time to get back to Portland. So what do you do? What happens next?
Well, we had to get all the equipment together, which is also practically buried in this smell. And so we throw it in the courtesy car that they had given us from the airport and pile all the gear in there. And then we sit inside the car. And of course, we're just overwhelmed. The windows are down, even though it's November. We head to the airport. We get to the airport. We're overwhelmed by this. The pilot, of course, who's with us, he helped out in terms of hauling the tripod around occasionally. Anyway, so he's there. And of course, he's totally taken aback. He realizes he has to get into this little small airplane. It's a 4-seater, that's it, with us that smell so bad. And he's got this little tiny window, about this big that he can open up to vent the inside with some kind of fresh air, which he immediately opens. And I don't know how he survived the thing. So we haul all that gear and then get in the plane, fly back to Portland. How we got good weather during November, I'll never know, but good enough to fly in a little single engine airplane. Yeah, so then we get back to Portland, and I'll let Paul tell the rest of that one.
Here's a twist to the story, Paul, as you know.
Yeah, and so the bane of a TV cameraman's existence is a reporter or an anchor person who won't help schlep gear. So I always made sure I did. And I, along with Doug, unloaded our gear from the car into the aircraft. When we got back to Portland and landed and went to unload the gear, we realized that the main magazine of film from the sound camera was not there. And Doug thought I had put it in the aircraft from the trunk, and I thought that he had put it in the aircraft from the trunk, and it wasn't there. So we went back to the station. We were too late to make the 11 o'clock news, even if we had film. And we went back to the station and told our boss, Pat Wilkins, who sent us what had happened and how amazing it was and how we're going to have the story the next day that's just going to blow everybody away. But we don't have the film. Pat said,
And you still had a job.
well, he said, that whale will be exploding on our 5 o'clock news tomorrow on Channel 2, or you're done, and I'm not hiring you another damn plane. So Doug will pick up the story from there, I'm quite sure.
So realizing the gravity of the situation, I called down to the flight office at the airport, got a hold of the guy that knew about the courtesy car and said, I believe he left something in there. I mean, it's a black colored magazine on the black upholstery that's in the trunk. Maybe that was the reason we didn't see it.
Yeah, that was
in any case. We wondered if you could go check if you have it. And is there any way that maybe we could meet up someplace on I-5 and recover this? And the guy said, well, actually, a son-in-law, I think it was, some relative was moving to Portland or Albany or something. And he said, you can meet them on I-5. I'll go out and check. And he did find it. And he says, I'll give that to them and they'll do that. So yeah, we traveled down I-5, got the film, brought it back to Portland, developed it. And then Paul looked at it, pulled our sound bites after we developed it, and then put the story together, edited it, and got it on the news. Thankfully, because Pat Wilkins was doing one of these the entire time.
So Paul, take us through your process as you were putting the story together and thinking about the narration, and how'd that work?
Kerry, that was 50 years ago. I have no idea.
Sure you do.
Pretty simple process. I mean, you just write the story as it happened, and if you're writing for video, you're always thinking of what pictures go with what words. But and it came together pretty easily. I mean, it wasn't a hard story to write. All you have to do is not waste too much time to get to the explosion. But one interesting thing about that story, that countdown you have on the story, 9, 10, 8, 9, 8, 7. That was technologically impossible at the time. How did we get that countdown on film? And that was a bit of creation on the part of Mr. Brazil there.
Yeah, they call it a slate. And so they have the K2 logo on a big, huge thing that's a carpenter's joy that they haul around. And so they put that in front of the videotape machine and they do a countdown. So we somehow got those folks there to do kind of an AV roll so that they could superimpose the countdown and nothing else. So all you saw was that little countdown with the film. And so we got that, and that's how the countdown appears there. It's a little off sync, but yeah.
We thought it was pretty amazing.
Here's a
Yep.
question, Paul, that came in, and Doug, it says, someone wants to hear about the shooting and editing process. Since it was shot on a 16mm film and had to be processed at the lab before being edited and shown on multiple film projectors during the newscast, correct?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, and we had a film processor in the building, at Channel 2. So the film comes out of the soup. I take the sound, listen to the sound bites I want to use, cut them out. We're using hot splicers. And I go write the script, building in the sound bites. I hand the script to Doug. He takes the other film, the B-roll, and puts it all together. And it's, it's not a long process. It's pretty quick.
Do the original reels still exist somewhere?
Well, it was cut for the 11 o'clock for that night.
Recut.
Pardon me?
It was re-edited for the 11.
Re-edited, right.
Made
What I
shorter.
was gonna say.
But Carrie, as you know, Channel 2 historically has given all of its film to Oregon Historical Society.
Thank
So
you.
if the original film exists, you have it.
Someone says, did you have to throw all your clothes away?
Well, I think Burnham was a better idea.
Yeah, no, I think we clean things up pretty good. The part of the story that I most regret not getting to, because I really wasn't aware of it, there is a marine biologist at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, who is probably the world's foremost authority on whales. His name is Dr. Bruce Mate. He was there that day, and we didn't know it. He was a 24-year-old graduate student, a year older than Doug and I. And he had asked the state employees who were there if he could have permission to go and take some samples from the dead whale. They kind of treated him like a kid that was in the way, and he was allowed to make some measurements. But he said if he'd been allowed to take some samples and possibly some organ material from various parts of the whale, it would have advanced the knowledge of why sperm whales wash up on beaches and die and such immensely. But he wasn't allowed to do so. So years later, I think around the 25th anniversary, we went back and interviewed Dr. Mate at the Hatfield Marine Science Center and got further insight. But I so wish I could have caught up with him as a graduate student that day to give us better insight as to, his thoughts on what was going on with this largest of all mammals, the sperm whale.
So do you remember what day of the week the story began on, or what the?
It was Thursday.
Shot on Thursday.
So then the story then ran on Friday?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the story runs, what's the reaction?
Well, Paul, thoughtfully, he contacted ABC. This aired on a Friday. He contacts ABC, the weekend desk, and says, I've got this great story about a whale blowing up on the Oregon beach. Are you guys interested? And the guy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but he says, not really. Back in those days, you'd have to ship the story to them. You record it on tape, 2-inch tape or something, and ship it back to him. He said, not really. And then on Sunday, he tried again, persevered, and the weekend producer for that day said, sure, send it out. And so I'll let Paul tell you the rest.
Well, it was on the ABC Weekend News with Sam Donaldson.
Yeah.
And his intro was a reference to Murphy's Law, that if anything could possibly go wrong, it certainly will. And he said the people in Oregon know what that means tonight. And then he introduced the thought of a dead whale being removed from an Oregon beach. And here's ABC's Paul Linnman to bring the rest of the story. So they ran it. And
not just K2's Paul Linnman, but ABC's Paul
ABC's,
Linnman.
yes,
Hey,
indeed.
You're big time.
Big time. But I didn't make as much money as Doug did for that. You told me the other day, Carrie, you read in the book 115 and 107.
You got 105, it says in the
105.
book, and Doug got 117.50 from ABC.
Yep.
So.
He had a better union.
And is that all the money you've made from this?
Yes.
Yeah.
But back to the reaction. If you're a reporter and a photographer and your job every day is to go out and cover stories, you move on. And yesterday's stories are barely a memory, and you're off to new subject matter. And that's one of the things that makes the job really, really fascinating. And all of a sudden, people are asking us about this whale and asking for copies of the video and the film. And We're hearing from all branches of the military. We're hearing from police and fire departments. We're hearing from hazmat teams, all sending us letters steeped in officialese about why this hazmat team in Minnesota needs to know and realize that anything can go wrong, and you have to be prepared for every eventuality. And it would go on and on and on and on as to why we needed to share this film with whatever organization was asking. And Doug came up with a rather, I thought, unique way of deciding who gets it right away and who doesn't. Would you care to share that, Doug?
Well, basically it was, at least as I recall, 50 years ago. And actually most of the publicity came after Dave Barry's column. But the letters that came in, Army Corps of Engineers, I mean, if it was an organization that seemed pretty legitimate rather than another TV station or something, the decision was made that we'll try to get them a copy of the video. But generally stayed away from anything that might be rebroadcast or anything like that. But we got stuff from, whale preservation people. And so it was really unusual that you want to see a whale being blown up? Never could understand that part. But I still have, there's a file folder that's about this thick of letters from the people. I just decided to keep those because the interest was so intense.
Yeah, but in time, Doug finally, as I recall, decided that there were so many requests, he would be quick to answer those that said, we think it'd be pretty funny or pretty cool to see this. We'd like to have some laughs. Those are the ones that got it first. The ones that wouldn't get off the official reasoning, they were last in line.
Right.
So
Dave Barry's column was really, I see some of our listeners are commenting on the Miami Herald column that he wrote. The Far Side was the name of his column.
And that's what really made this into world famous, was Dave Barry's column, and then the advent of the internet, of course.
The internet too. But when Barry declared it was the single most funny news story in history, that seemed to get everybody's attention. And then the internet, and all of a sudden it's all over the place, and still is.
So were you able to meet Dave Barry or talk to him? Or?
Yes, couple of times, and he came on a talk show I was doing on Channel 2 at the time in later years, and I was really looking forward to meeting him. And I love Dave Barry. He's a great humorist. And when I met him, the first time, he was kind of cool toward me. I met him back in our green room, and I said, "Hey, Dave, I'm Paul Linnman." He said, "Nice to meet you." And I said, "I'm the whale guy." And he said, "You're what?" I said, "I'm the reporter on The Exploding Whale." And he kind of went, "Oh." And I thought, wow, maybe he thinks I'm making this up. I'm trying to pull something off on him or something. And I didn't really understand it for a while. And I knew that on his lecture circuit, he used the exploding whale story as his final payoff story. And so I decided I'll go catch up with him on the lecture circuit and see how he does it. And I was planning to go to San Francisco, which is the nearest city to Portland that he was appearing in, and it fell through and I wasn't able to make the trip. But I did get a tape of what he did. And guess what? In his presentations, he kind of busts me. I'm like the typical TV guy with the hair and the tie and the coat and the talk and the flash and all that. And so I get it. There's this thing, Carrie, about print versus broadcast. There's this kind of thing. So he came some 2 years later back to the station to be on the talk show again. And I walked into the green room. I said, "Hey, Dave, I'm the whale guy. What are you busting me for?" And then he started to laugh. And we have had great talks about that story ever since. And when I wrote the book, he blurbed, what a wonderful book it was, and gave me all sorts of help. And I always tell people, between Philip Margolin, Ann Rule, and Dave Barry, the blurb writing on the back of the book is much better than the writing that's inside the book.
So, and then when did you first begin to realize, holy whale, Batman, this is a international, fascination?
Well, it has grown over the years, and like I've said before, a rare day in my life is when the whale is not mentioned to me. And it's been like that for, 40 some years or more. And strangers will recognize me from television work and come up and say, "Hey, you're the guy that blew up the whale." And I said, "No, I'm not. I didn't blow it up. I was there." And early in the morning, somebody will say, "Hey, I bet I'm the first guy to mention the whale." And I'll say, "No, guy half hour ago in Starbucks mentioned the whale. You're second." And so I just kind of got used to it. And then I went through a period where I didn't want to hear about it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to see the video. And I just had enough of it. But I passed through that and I realized, well, you know, the world is interested in this story that Doug and I have produced. And I should be thankful for that. You know, if I've created something that allows people to come up and have conversations with me or others about something they saw was fascinating, I guess that's a pretty good thing. And most of us will do our work and pass on and never be thought of again. Maybe, just maybe, because of the stupid whale, somebody will remember me someday.
Doug, you agree with those remarks?
Yeah, of course. It staggers the imagination to think that something, this kind of occurrence would actually be around still 50 years later. I mean, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary. Many of us could not probably remember back that far, and yet now it's still on the internet. It's still getting hits. I sometimes I don't get it. Obviously, Paul Linnman was the face. I was the guy behind the camera. But still, I get people, "Oh, yeah, I saw your name on the," yeah, it's one of those. It's pretty funny.
And this week, Carrie, has really been a payoff. I mean, you've seen what's happened online and how many news organizations have picked up the story and so forth. I think I've been interviewed more this week. I still do a talk show on KEX Radio in Portland. I think I've been interviewed more than I've interviewed others this week. And unique questions come along, questions you've never been asked before. And it's just been pure fun. Somebody at the New York Times wrote that, Doug, today I read this, you and I produced the most legendary single local TV news story of the century. And that was from a New York Times reporter. So what the heck? Pretty neat.
Someone just wrote in that I think you are more famous than Tanya Harding, whose 50th birthday is today.
That's right.
The whale and Tanya on the same day.
I told the guys in my studio today, if it weren't for this obligation, I'd take Tanya out and we'd have a couple of non-alcoholic beers.
You didn't get any money, Paul, but I understand you got several trips to Italy from this. So tell us about that.
Well, that is the very greatest payoff of all for me from the Exploding Whale. There's a graduate business school in Oslo, Italy, which is about an hour and a half northwest of Venice at the foot of the Dolomites, just this beautiful village. And an American educator left college education here to start this business school. 50 American universities feed into the Consortium Institute for Business and Management Analysis, including Portland State and the University of Oregon. He contacted me years ago and said, would you come and lecture at our graduate school about the exploding whale? And I said, why would your students be interested in that? And he said, we're using your book in our international problem solving curriculum. What is a better solution than dynamite? And I kind of passed on it for a couple of years, and then some travel fell through, and I contacted the guy. I said, yeah, I'd like to come. So we went, and I lectured for a couple of days, not only their international problem solving classes, but their journalism students and career planning and other classes, the most engaged graduate students from America in Italy that I've ever been around. They asked me to join the board of the graduate school and come back 3 or 4 times a year. And when they did so, my wife, Vicki, is standing nearby, and I can see her, and Doug, you'll appreciate this. She's kind of going. So we get into the car that's taking us back to the airport, and I said, who turns down free trips to Europe 3 or 4 times a year and great honorariums? Why don't you want to? She said, somebody who's married to a guy who doesn't get enough vacation. I can't come back here 4 times a year. There are other places I'd like to go. So in the time since, we've gone back, I think, a couple of times, and we'll probably go back again. But to me, that's been the payoff. I mean, a week in Venice, engaged in these students in this beautiful mountain village, and talking about a subject that they're interested in talking about. And they are brilliant kids. One of them came over and interned at the radio station I work for now. And that's been the big payoff for me.
But Doug, no trips to Italy for you. Paul didn't invite you? Oh, you're on mute, Doug.
You're muted, Doug.
Sorry.
There you go, you were muted.
Yep. Well, I've been to Florence, but it was Florence, Oregon. So that's about as close as I got to the Italy part.
Yeah. See, he's in his beach house in Nesquin on the Oregon coast right now. I don't have a beach house. So somehow Doug got a greater payoff from the whale than I did.
The whale didn't pay for this.
Some questions coming in, Paul. While you were there, did you ever find out, were there other options than dynamite? Why did they land on dynamite?
There weren't other good options for a whale that large. A pod of whales washed up in the very south of that location shortly thereafter, and they buried them. They've been burned in the past. It all depends on the size of the whale. That whale was too big and had been decaying too long for them to easily pick up. And that's why dynamite was considered the best option. They can't drag them out. They'll pull the whale apart. The ocean pushes them back in. They can't bury them. The water under the sand pushes them back up. So, and it was the United States Navy that was consulting with our highway department that told them what to do, and said later, yeah, they didn't use enough dynamite.
And George, a lot of questions about George Thornton, who I know has passed away since then, but and who actually got a promotion after this, correct?
Yes, he did. And he was a good man. And I really wanted to catch up with him, because one thing that we did with the story, one thing we tried not to do, was to make ODOT look silly, or to, in any way act as if this man had made a lousy decision and really messed things up, because that really wasn't the case. And years later, when I was writing the book, I really wanted to get together with George Thornton and have another interview with him, and a heart-to-heart, and apologize to him if he felt in any way we demeaned him. And he didn't want to see me. And I went through public affairs. And by the way, the Oregon Department of Transportation, Ed Shopes, Dave Thompson, Don Hamilton, great people to work with. They get you all the information. They're totally transparent. In fact, they used the Exploding Whale video for many years, welcoming new employees as kind of an icebreaker, and as a way of saying, hey, we can laugh at ourselves too. You're joining an organization that is aware and is not uptight. But I asked one of their public affairs people to contact Mr. Thornton for me on my behalf and request an interview. And his response was given to me point blank. He said, no, every time I talk to the press, it seems to blow up in my face. I thought that was ironic. I don't know if he was messing with us or not, but we never got together again. But he was a good man, and he deserved the promotion.
We've talked about Italy tonight. You go in there, Paul, and the people on this call from other countries. You mentioned to me that for some reason, England has a big fascination with this.
I don't know if it's England so much, it's the BBC.
BBC?
Yeah, and they have interviewed us several times throughout the last several years. And I'll share one quick story. I was contacted by a producer of a BBC program that needed me on the air live that night. And so we made arrangements to be on the phone. And I didn't know if it was TV or radio or what it was. And so I made a connection at the appropriate time, and this producer person says, you'll be live in 10 seconds. Now, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I heard the presenter, it was a woman. And she said, she was reporting on a whale in Taiwan. This is a few years ago now, that it was sitting on the back of a flatbed truck, a dead whale, that, you remember this, Doug, that blew up for no apparent reason. And so I heard her making reference to that. And then the next thing I hear her say in this wonderful British accent is, joining us now from Portland, Oregon, is America's leading expert on exploding whales, Mr. Paul Linnman. And I go, oh no. And she said, Mr. Linnman, thank you for being with us so much. Could you please explain to us why this whale in Taiwan blew up? And I didn't want to make her look silly, and I didn't want to sound like an idiot. So I said, well, to tell you the truth, it's probably not known, but it was a hot day in Taiwan. It was 88 degrees. I happened to read about it, and the organs and gases and juices are still active in the whale, and it sits in the hot sun, and all the wrong conditions came together and the thing blew up. But honestly, I'm not necessarily a blowing up whale expert. I'm an expert about Oregon's exploding whale. There's this pause, and then she absolutely giggled. And she said, oh, you have to forgive me. We've been laughing about that over here for years. I said, lady, you don't know the half of it. And then she went on to interview me about Oregon's exploding whale, and it turned out okay. But for a moment there in Great Britain, I was an expert.
Nothing bad about that. So other memories of things that have come in, and especially on his 50th anniversary. I know the 25th anniversary, there were many reports on that, including a report from KGON in San Francisco, which we'll put on the chat section, a link to it so people can get to it. So
yeah, KGO had an excellent features reporter named Wayne Friedman, and he came up and spent a few days with us, and he did a series on our story and its production. Do you remember working with Wayne, Doug?
Yes.
He won an Emmy for his series on our story. And I always thought that was rather interesting. The other interesting thing, I don't know if you want me to show it or not, Carrie, but among the stories we've done in the years since, I was contacted by a man who lived in McMinnville, Oregon, who was a massage therapist, and who told me over the phone that before the State Highway Department got to the whale, he had been there. He climbed into the whale's mouth and removed 3 of its back teeth. And he had cut them up and polished them like you would an agate. And he wanted to know if I wanted a chunk. And so we went and did a story on him. His name is David Banks. And here is that piece of whale tooth that David Banks pulled out of the dead whale. He said when he was in the whale's mouth, he had to come out every so many minutes because the smell was so overwhelming.
now, Paul, in our collection at the Oregon Historical Society, we have a bone from a whale that Lewis and Clark saw when they were out here. So I think perhaps that in your last will and testament, you leave that tooth to the Oregon Historical Society. So,
well, I'd be happy to do that, Carrie. I came up with an idea to mark my ball with it when I putt. And it would kind of point to the direction that I need. What do you think?
I like it. So,
but after my golf days are over, you bet, it's my contribution.
Listen, we had a question email from Les Batten, who you folks know from KGW. He says he's known you for 50 years. This is the first time he knew that you left the film in the car.
Les is a good friend of both of ours and an excellent photographer himself. I don't know. It wasn't that we were keeping it from you, Les. It's just something we don't like to talk about. We're supposed to be professionals.
Well, it does mean that Les hasn't read your book because it's in your book.
Yeah, well,
which by the way is available at the OHS gift shop. So
yeah, and I just would add Les is not much of a reader. That's so funny that he checks in.
So a bit about Sarah. I think you have. Paul gets a little. This is your license plate.
Yes, it is.
How do you get away with that?
Well, it wasn't my idea. Somebody on Facebook, when the Vanity whale plate came out, which was last year, I believe, somebody wrote on Facebook, Paul Linnman should have Explode on his. And I didn't think it was a good idea initially, but I mentioned it to a couple of people who thought it was a good idea. And knowing that the state wouldn't put that word on the license plate, I filled out the application, sent in my money, and lo and behold, 2 months later, the plates arrived. So they're still on my car. And when I drive around, I feel compelled to be very careful and very courteous and very cautious because somebody might figure out who's driving this car. And if I mess up, I'm going to hear about it later. But I've had fun with this plate, and I've actually had a few people ask me to explain it. So there are those that are around that don't even know about this exploding whale, apparently.
So I'm looking at some more questions coming in, making sure we've got everyone's answered. What do they do with whales now? I think you've touched upon that, haven't you?
Yeah, they pretty much, they'll bury them. You know, I also know that the state policy is that if the whale is beached in an area that doesn't have a lot of public, you know, we do have, I want to say wilderness, but we do have desolate beach areas. And if the whale washes up in an area where there's not a lot of public activity, they'll leave it there if it's a small one. So that's true. One thing I think, I don't remember if I put this in the book or not, maybe I did. We have a former governor in our state who I found out years later had his own copy of the whale, Governor Kitzhaber. And he would call me occasionally at the television station if a whale washed up, laughing. And he'd say, "Hey, Paul, this is the governor. We need you in Newport. There's a whale. Goodbye." And and he'd make 3 or 4 of those calls. So we were at an event one night and the governor and his wife was there. And I said, "Why does John call me about the whales washing up and think that's so funny. She's always got his own video. And I said, why? And she said, he wants to be reminded on his worst days in government that it could be a lot worse. He could have worse days. So he watches that. And she says, when he watches it, I know he's had a bad day.
A visitor makes the point that your book is more than the exploding whale story. Yes. That's lots of other interesting chapters about some really great, touching, human interest stories you covered too as a reporter.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm glad the listener brought it up, because I did a series on the ABC station in Portland called Spirit of the Northwest, and they asked me to do 20 of these so that they could mount a promotional campaign. I did 20, and they were stories on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Before the series ended, we did 1,215 stories on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm very proud of that. And I don't know of any reporter anywhere who's done a 1,215 part series. I've just never heard of that. But the people in the book that are in alternate chapters are people that really amazed me for what they were doing in life. And so for years, people said, yeah, Paul, you ought to write a book about the whale. And I'd written another book, and I said, okay, I will, but it's not going to be just about the whale. So I did alternate chapters, whale and special person, whale and special person. And Philip Margolin, who is a best-selling crime writer and lawyer here in Portland, loved the whale book and asked if he could give it to his New York agent for national distribution by a larger publisher, published in Graphic Arts here in Portland. And he said, this book is going to go, this is going to be big. So his agent went to all the publishing houses. I've got copies of the letters that they sent back at the time, turning down the proposal. And they all said the same thing. We like the chapter on the whales, but what are all these other people doing in the book? So that's...
And you two were supposed to be in Florence this weekend, weren't you? So
yeah.
And because
supposed to be in Florence, yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yep.
And last May, during the Rhododendron Festival, they made the theme a blast from the past. I don't know if you ever saw their logo, Carrie, but it was a great group of rhododendrons. If you look closely, it was in the shape of a whale. And we were supposed to go down and ride in the parade and participate in all these activities. And of course, the pandemic knocked that out. There's a small outside gathering tomorrow afternoon in Florence that the mayor and some others are going to take part in that we had hoped to attend. But with the governor's pause order, we just decided we can't travel. And so we're going to miss that.
And we have someone who writes, I hope you two will come down to Roadie Days in Florence next year to celebrate.
Oh, I guaranteed them. If they ask us back, we'll be there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A question about what is your favorite art, poem, song, fan product about the whale? Because I know there's, if you Google Exploding Whale, you'll see this wonderful folk song this fellow wrote. But
yeah, I just read about that today. I don't have any favorites in that regard. Do you, Doug?
No, I have this whale over here, which is actually supposed to be a cat sleeper, but other than that.
Well, that's good. One of my sons actually emailed today. He said, why aren't we merchandising this? Why don't we have pint glasses and T-shirts? And well, we don't own the rights. And that's another fun part of the story. Doug came to me before we both left that television station one day and said, why don't we buy the rights to the whale? Okay. And because Channel 2 really didn't take a great interest in it. And Doug was the only guy responsible for sending it out. And I said, what do you think it would take? He said, $10,000. And I said, well, this thing has already been pirated, Doug, thousands of times. I'm not going to give $5,000, my share of the purchase price, for something that everybody already owns. And so we walked away and didn't do it. And not 2 weeks later, Channel 2 sold that video to NBC's World's Most Amazing Videos for a one-time use for $35,000. And that's the kind of business mind this reporter has. They're just really stupid about this stuff.
So here's a question from the listeners. Serious question, he says, if somebody had actually been seriously hurt or even killed by the flying blubber, how do you believe this event would have been covered at the time?
Well, I think it would have been covered as the tragedy that it was, and I don't think we'd be talking about it right now. This thing has lived on because it was unique, and because nobody's ever seen a whale. We love whales. We protect them. We don't blow them up. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. It's lived on. If it was a tragic story of somebody's death or serious injury, nope, that's how we would have reported it, and the world would have forgotten it within a matter of weeks or months, I believe.
So I'm hoping that we're getting close to the hour till 8 o'clock. And Sarah, I'm hoping that we can end here in a minute by showing the video again in case people missed it or came in late, and what a way to end. But I want to thank Paul and Doug, and 25 years from now, let's all make a pact that we'll be here doing the 75th anniversary program. And Paul, Doug, any parting thoughts? And Paul, do you want to share any stories from our golf round a couple weeks ago?
Well, Kerry shot a 73, was it, Kerry?
76. So.
76 and beat me mightily. I don't have any parting thoughts, except Doug and I have this disagreement. I interviewed Doug for the radio program today, and Doug thinks the reason the story has lived on is because of the copy. I think it's because of the pictures. So we both give each other credit. And if you're going to run it again, Kerry, can I be excused?
Sure. So yeah. And Doug, any closing thoughts?
Well, I once again, I'll reiterate that I think that this, as a film in itself, The Exploding Whale, it's an eye catcher, but really doesn't hold that well. It would not hold like it has over the past 20, 50 years now. Were it not for the way that Paul put it together as a semi-serious story and with a little poetry involved, there's something that carries. That's what people smile about when they're watching the story. It's not the fact that the whale is getting blown up, but it's just what Paul said. And so
No, it's TV. It's the pictures.
Yeah. Anyway, so I give him a lot of credit.
Well, Paul and Doug, thank you for the role you played in documenting what will always go down as one of the most famous and infamous events in Oregon history, and especially in times like this, to be able to get together for an hour for a wonderful time and laugh and share memories. That's something we all need now.
Kerry, thank you and your staff, Sarah and Rachel, and for having us, and to all the guests who joined us tonight. I hope I bump into you on the street and we talk about the whale sometime. Kerry, thank you for putting it all together.
You bet.
Yeah,
So we're going to run the film one more time, and go to our website, and you can find out more information about the newly digitized version, where the blubber and the blood and the guts are really in high def and much more vibrant. So I know you'll want to see that. And so Sarah, if you could run the video again, we'll run it, and then we'll end when it's done. Thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you,
Here it
Kerry.
comes again.
Thanks, Kerry.
It had to be said, the Oregon State Highway Division not only had a whale of a problem on its hands, it had a stinking whale of a problem. What to do with one 45-foot, 8-ton whale dead on arrival on the beach near Florence.
It had been so long since a whale had washed up in Lane County, nobody could remember how to get rid of one. In selecting its battle plan, the Highway Division decided the carcass couldn't be buried because it might soon be uncovered. It couldn't be cut up and then buried because nobody wanted to cut it up, and it couldn't be burned. So dynamite it was, some 20 cases or a half-ton of it. The hope was that the long-dead Pacific gray whale would be almost disintegrated by the blast, and that any small pieces still around after the explosion would be taken care of by seagulls and other scavengers. Indeed, the seagulls had been standing nearby all day. As everything was being made ready, we asked George Thornton, the highway engineer in charge of the project, for his final observation.
Well, I'm confident that it'll work. The only thing is we're not sure just exactly how much explosives it'll take to disintegrate this thing so the scavengers, seagulls, and crabs and whatnot can clean it up.
Is there any chance it might be more than a one-day job?
If there's any large chunks left, and we may have to do some other cleanup, possibly set another charge.
The dynamite was buried primarily on the leeward side of the big mammal, so as most of the remains would be blown toward the sea. About 75 bystanders, most of them residents who had first found the whale to be an object of curiosity before they tired of its smell, were moved back a quarter of a mile away. The sand dunes there were covered with spectators and landlubber newsmen, shortly to become land blubber newsmen, for the blast blasted blubber beyond all believable bounds.
You get a wow?
All right, Fred, you can take your hands out of your ears. Here comes pieces of...
Our cameras stopped rolling immediately after the blast. The humor of the entire situation suddenly gave way to a run for survival as huge chunks of whale blubber fell everywhere. Pieces of meat passed high over our heads while others were falling at our feet. The dunes were rapidly evacuated as spectators escaped both the falling debris and the overwhelming smell. A parked car over a quarter of a mile from the blast site was the target of one large chunk. The passenger compartment literally smashed. Fortunately, no human was hit as badly as the car. However, everyone on the scene was covered with small particles of dead whale. As for the success of the effort, well, the seagulls who were supposed to clean things up were nowhere in sight, either scared away by the explosion or kept away by the smell. That didn't really matter. The remaining chunks were of such a size that no respectable seagull would attempt to tackle anyway. As darkness began to set in, the highway crews were back on the beach burying the remains, including a large piece of the carcass which never left the blast site. It might be concluded that should a whale ever wash ashore in Lane County again, those in charge will not only remember what to do, they'll certainly remember what not to do.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.